What do you think we should do with the wall?
Leave it bare then. Wait for revelation to enter the room.
This happens to be the same wall that Louis smashes Armand on after discovering his role in the trial. Before 1976, vampires in books and movies were stuck in the Bram Stoker mold from his classic novel Dracula. They were lone predators that a brave crew of vampire hunters would chase down. These vampires only showed up occasionally to terrify everyone before meeting a dramatic end. In 1976, Anne Rice broke the mold with Interview with the Vampire, shifting the traditional paradigm. Not only the monsters weren't solitary anymore, actually forming familial types of bonds and communities.
We're a family?
Yeah. But with no secrets.
All right.
But the focus went from the hunters to the vampires themselves. Rice's story is told from the vampire's point of view, in a first-person narration, whereas the frame story is narrated in third-person limited perspective. Because although Louis shares his tale directly, the narration is in dialogue form. This is an interview where he has margin to craft what he wants to relate to Daniel, and obviously to us.
Who are you, Louis?
I'm your brother.
What do you want? How you gonna get there?
Basically, we don't really know what Louis is thinking, only what he says he's thinking. This means that Louis has often been categorized as an unreliable narrator. About this categorization, it's important to note two things. One, unreliable narrator doesn't necessarily equate to liar, and two, every character in the Vampire Chronicles universe is to some extent an unreliable narrator, because having competing POVs is the narrative structure of the entire text, and one of the most interesting declinations that the series successfully translates. It opens up for a larger introspective view of each character and how their traumas, memories, and flaws lead to a complex, layered, intertwined narrative canvas across space and time. These continuous revisitations of the past that impact on matters of continuity, the ways in which Rice's vampires especially carry the past with them as a haunted artifact, tie immortality and timelessness to memories, or undead memories, as Bacon and Bronk aptly conceptualize in their 2013 book, that seem even more alive than the present. The past intruding into the present is a big part of what makes the concept of living Gothic. It emphasizes how the everyday exposes the Gothic's obsessions with death and the mutability of the past. Through this intricate interplay, Interview with the Vampire vividly brings to life the essence of the living Gothic, where the past is a living, breathing entity that refuses to be forgotten. Past events, whether in the form of dreams, ghosts, or memories and stories, return to haunt and influence the present. The plot often takes both an implicit and explicit circular approach, where each perspective on events adds new details or invites to fresh interpretations. We'll see examples of both in the course of this video. Consider also the profound impact of trauma and its impact on each of every one of these very different characters. Guilt, whether for actions taken or perceived, as well as shame, further complicates one's narrative. This is so evident in Louis, how his perceived otherness by everyone around him, and consequently what he internalizes, is not just the vampiric extra-human existence, it's also the color of his skin and his sexual orientation. Through this lens, it becomes obvious that Interview with the Vampire can be analyzed with greater complexity than the notion of unreliable narration alone. Let's dive deep. Louis' unreliability is mostly evident because the story being narrated is placed within a different context through the framing device. The framing device is a narrative technique whereby a story is framed by a secondary story, creating a story within a story. The framing device here is that Daniel interviewed Louis back in San Francisco in 1973 and is re-interviewing him now in Dubai about the same events. And the two versions differ markedly, especially in relation to Louis' and Lestat's relationship.
Yeah, I gotta say, it's not so much the minute details, Louis, rather the total rewrite that's giving me pause here.
Although in both accounts the relationship appears somehow destructive, the tone varies significantly. In the 1973 interview, Louis portrays Lestat as a negative influence, describing him as inferior and detrimental to his own growth, underscoring his disdain for Lestat.
He appeared frail and stupid to me. He was a sow's ear out of which nothing fine could be made. I was his complete superior, and I had been sadly cheated in having him for a teacher.
Conversely, in 2022, Louis characterizes Lestat as a source of warmth. The imagery called fire, he surrounded me, evokes feelings of comfort and security.
It was a cold winter that year, and Lestat was my cold fire, and I found myself for the very first time, to anyone other than Paul, confiding my struggles to another man. I had never allowed myself to feel emotionally close to anyone, much less a man. Lestat had surrounded me.
It's obvious Louis suppresses and antagonizes his feelings for Lestat for several reasons. Shame about his attraction to another man, shame about being a vampire, religious guilt are just some of them. His trauma manifests in a narrative that oscillates between moments of tenderness and episodes of profound despair, reflecting his ongoing struggle to reconcile his past actions with his sense of morality. By episode 14, we also understand why Louis would hold such negative views of Lestat, given the part he did play and or Louis thought he played in the trial. His retelling of Lestat is obviously going to be influenced by that. In Claudia's turning scene, for example, the first version portrays a mocking Lestat almost as malicious. In the retelling, however, Lestat appears more conflicted, showing vulnerability and eventually giving in to Louis. It's evident here that Louis manipulates Lestat's fear of abandonment.
That's why you're always gonna be alone. I'll stay. I'll never leave you, ever again. I promise. I'll be happy. For you, for her.
In order to convince him to turn Claudia, which Louis later admits to Daniel. Similarly, Lestat acknowledges his grave mistake in causing Louis so much pain back in New Orleans, though the accounts of their fight differ. Despite these variations, Lestat still recognizes his fault in the outcome and acknowledges the additional trauma that it caused Louis.
Did he break you, Louis? Are you broken?
No?
And afterwards, he was a broken thing. I know, I saw, because I am the one who broke him.
Louis believed that turning and therefore saving Claudia would atone for the destruction that he had caused, while Lestat agreed to turn Claudia because he knew it would make Louis happy. In season 1, this act is portrayed as a redemption for Louis.
You have a kid. Girl's an orphan. Adopted her off of Liberty Street. Did right by it.
In season 2, more details tell us that it was reckless of Louis to turn Claudia and that he acted selfishly, despite Lestat's warnings about the consequences of making a vampire so young. Louis was driven by his desperation to try and fix his mistakes, and perhaps to an extent to even fix his own identity, which is monstrous by design and that he found very difficult to accept.
You're ashamed of what we are.
Maybe I'm just pondering what I am.
For the infinitesimal time. You're a vampire.
Could you not use the word in my place of business?
We're shown this dichotomy straight away when Louis decides to turn Claudia, because right before his own mother accused him of being the devil, and right after Claudia defines him as an angel.
They asked if I was an angel. Me?
This desire to feel and be perceived as good drives a lot of Louis' choices and his narration.
I no longer kill. My last victim was in the year 2000.
Some Y2K disagreement?
I want our readers to understand that.
Okay. Did you eat the baby?
I sit here, a master of my instincts,
He often applies distance between himself and what he doesn't want to be associated with.
Funny thing, trying to remember what occupied one's time when one was ignorant of the plotting around him.
Here, Louis switches narrative perspective to the third person. He just talked about his early relationship with Armand, which he categorized as very innocent and very loving, almost naive. And what he recounts during that perspective switch is the time prior to that, the time spent with Lestat, which has slowly become the villainous figure of this story. Daniel, being a writer, immediately picks up on this.
It's a thing with syntax. I see it a lot. The impersonal pronoun, one, one's time, one didn't, becomes the third person, him, stops being I or me.
Armand does the same thing, perhaps even unconsciously, with an even messier back and forth switching when he recounts his traumatic past in the museum.
He's 20 years here. He was rescued from a brothel when he was 15. They had sold him into slavery. He's renaming me, knowing what it would do to his beloved Amadeo. I served him with all my heart. Amadeo had a skill. I was occasionally donated.
Louis employs a similar distancing technique when recounting the time at Théâtre des Vampires. While his dislike for the coven is evident, I would say practically factual, what he chooses to emphasize in his narration places him in a unique position compared to all the other vampires, because Louis casts himself as a passive observer rather than an active participant. He is attempting to distance himself from the monstrous nature of the rest of the vampires. By aligning himself with the mortal audience in the theater, he becomes a spectator of the macabre performances rather than a participant, thus framing himself as a victim. During this period of time in Paris, Louis navigates a state of self-victimization, existing in a liminal space between voyeur, vampire, and mortal.
I took up photography as a hobby.
Vampires with hobbies. Insanity.
He carefully controls his portrayal, the flow of events, and what he reveals or withholds. Louis deliberately adopts a passive role, presenting himself as a mere witness. By aligning with the audience, he seeks absolution from guilt. His voyeurism reflects a superficial sensitivity. He watches, reacts with disgust, but does not look away and doesn't go away. What differentiates, obviously, Louis from the rest of the audience is his true nature. He is one of the monsters that he is observing. By positioning himself as an unwilling participant, Louis avoids the starring role of the hero or the villain. The show plays with this folding together of illusion and disillusion in a number of ways.
Truth is more valuable if it takes you a few years to find it.
It follows a quest to uncover the truth about vampires throughout the first episodes of the second season. Claudia persuades Louis to revisit their origins in Transylvania. Then we go to Paris, the mother of New Orleans, and the city which has given New Orleans life. There they encounter the Théâtre des Vampires, where real vampires perform as vampires for an audience, presenting an illusion, theatricality of an illusion. Real vampires. This theme culminates in the 14th episode, where different manipulations and agenda unfold during the trial. Claudia's performance while burning
like windows when they're closed
is a striking example of intrinsic theatricality. But remember that at this point, the perspective shifted to Armand. He's the one that is recounting what happened, and Armand happens to be a theater person. It becomes a performative interview of a performative play from over 70 years ago, naturally creates layers and layers of subjectivity and deception.
The tapes are an admitted performance. This is the premise of our interview. Half a century later, allow me my odyssey.
When Louis asks Daniel to allow him his odyssey of recollection, the show conveys two key ideas. The first is that a rewriting is taking place, and secondly, truth is an illusion. Memory is the only true narrative. An interview with the vampire reinforces that all the time. Daniel and Louis destroy files, write over existing records, read through only pre-selected diary pages. Scenes are reimagined in different contexts. As such, the show embodies the concept of undead memory mentioned before in the intro, where memories persist beyond their origin, similarly to vampires, and continue to affect the present in unsettling ways. These memories intrude persistently into the present, tearing through it like fragments of relentless remembrance. As Bacon and Bronx suggest, this form of undead memory refuses to remain buried, but can be seen to metaphorically feed off of the present, draining it of its forward impetus and normative continuity, and therefore narrative coherence. Similar to vampire, timeless, and immortal, so memories materialize into reality. They both safeguard the past, shape the future, and consume the present. Traumatic events and their memories often exist beyond linear time, trapping the characters of the show in an eternal nightmare.
What was that you said about memory? A monster, was it?
This obvious gothic loop then is curved by a forceful intrusion of past events into the protagonist's present-day reality. Past not only regains its sense of immediacy and relevance, but also acquires a revised perspective. The cyclical nature of the narrative mirrors the eternal status and experiences of the characters, with repeated patterns of behaviors across centuries. Armand is a very good example of this, which we will see better in the next chapter. But consider Louis too. In both season 1 and 2, Louis' actions towards Daniel reflect severe trauma responses. In season 1, triggered by Claudia's sexual assault, Louis aggravates Daniel's condition. Similarly, in episode 9, Louis forces Daniel to relieve the pain of Alice leaving him when he's forced to relieve Lestat's letter. Claudia and Lestat are powerful triggers. The emotions associated to both is not easily processed by Louis, which subsequently either suppresses them, diminishes their impact in the narrative when talking about it with Daniel, or lashes out. That's why it's particularly noteworthy that at the end of the second season, Louis refrains from killing Armand, just like he let go of his vendetta against Sam, as well as progressively admitting more and more his role in the difficult relationship with Lestat. This gradual processing of trauma culminates in Louis' final acceptance of his vampiric identity, which is portrayed incredibly well in the final scene.
Hear this now, and hear it plain. I own the night.
This journey that Louis takes is visualized clearly even in the style. Throughout both seasons, Louis is constantly portrayed either in grays or completely in black during his time in Dubai. This is symbolic of his grief and contrasts with his previous stylistic choices back in New Orleans, where he favored colors, to Louis recounting his story, adjusting his narrative, and the dialogue with Daniel is almost therapeutic. The show even visually supports that by making it look like Louis and Armand are going through a couple therapy of sorts. At the beginning of season 2, they are close in proximity, pretending everything is fine, and by the end of season 2, the visual distance within them is enormous. When Armand agrees to be part of the record or session, he and Louis often speak at the same time, finishing each other's sentences.
I will... Please.
No. Please.
It really does look like an old married couple recounting the first time they met, but their intimacy has an antagonistic undercurrent to it. The complacency of Louis feels quite uncomfortable, actually, for the character that we've come to know. Despite his effort to try to portray himself as docile, collected, and nice vampire, remember that the first time that we see Louis, he has a knife at his brother's throat. This aggression also presents itself despite trying to wear a bohemian artist's laissez-faire persona, even in the time in Paris when Santiago humiliates him in the restaurant. This is the truth of Louis' nature, something that Lestat understood quite well.
I have 2 centuries walked this earth and can report you have no twin. No one as angry, as stubborn, as unaccommodating, as maddening,
It's all like trash, Daddy.
as loving, as dedicated, as thoughtful, as imperfectly perfect as you've become. You're a challenge every sunset, Saint Louis, and I'd have it no other way.
When Armand enters the interview, it suddenly becomes a plural perspective, fundamentally driven by Armand's obsession with control. Armand's pathology is based on possession. Because of the traumatic exploitation that he suffered and endured in the past, his true north for every relationship is ownership, because that's the only version of love that he knows. That's why, although he's one of the most powerful vampires currently in the show, he's comfortable in presenting himself as harmless and defenseless.
Are you asking or making me?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. Make sure we're not bothered. Yeah?
In order to achieve possession and ownership, Armand doesn't favor chaos. He struggles for structure and structured and expected behaviors, which he can anticipate and control. This inclination can be traced back to his time as a slave, where he was compelled to adopt submissive roles. Over time, he grew comfortable in these positions because they provided predictability and allowed him to be manipulative without the need to outright challenge those in dominant roles. We see when placed in authoritative positions, Armand is uncomfortable and is incapable of maintaining control.
Rashid, did you and Mr. Malloy talk to anyone during dinner?
Just the chef when ordering, sir.
Were you with Mr. Malloy the entire dinner?
He used the restroom for approximately 5 minutes.
Had a piece of halibut that still wanted to swim.
You were not to leave Mr. Malloy alone.
He didn't. Stood by the hand dryer like a creep.
Why do you ask? Love?
Throughout the centuries, he has learned that maintaining the illusion of power, often by assuming a submissive role himself, ensures the predictive equilibrium which he so desperately seeks. This strategy explains his willingness to let Louis assume dominance in their relationship, only superficially balancing their dynamic and reassuring Louis after his history with Lestat, where despite different narrations, there was an evident power imbalance.
I want you more than anything in the world.
You sure about that, Armand?
Yes, maître.
Armand's calm and collected behavior is a constructed appearance. His perceived position of submission is not without power. You can see this because whenever he doesn't want to do something, he simply doesn't do it. Compare, for example, how Lestat ended up turning Claudia because Louis asked him to. But when Louis asks Armand to turn Madeleine, he doesn't. Armand tries his best not to shatter the illusion though. He often directly doesn't do what he doesn't want to do, but calculates what would be necessary and further implements it by using everyone else around him to achieve the end result. Louis is the opposite. He's fiery, he's prone to outbursts. In episode 11, we see Louis being able to use the firepower only when angry. Armand instead unlocks his power by deconstructing the vulnerabilities of what's in front of him.
I try and find the vulnerability within the object.
Armand is apparently humiliated by Louis' hesitancy to define him as his companion. But when this happens in front of the coven, Armand just takes it, without challenging either Santiago or Louis. This is because it becomes obvious to Armand that Louis' fear stems from his previous relationship with Lestat.
Flex your power one night and follow it with grand groveling the next. Vintage Leoncourt.
Now, Armand has deconstructed Louis' vulnerability and realizes that he needs to place himself at the opposite spectrum of how Lestat was and or was perceived by Louis. That's why Armand constantly calls attention to his lack of control of the coven and how his leadership position is in jeopardy, and counters all of that by underlying that his priority is Louis.
It's not easy for me. You don't understand the danger I risk every night for you. How that danger compounds with every slight.
What slight?
You rarely join us for a hunt. You read novels during performances.
I've seen those plays 100 times.
I keep your secret.
He also invites Louis to know about his traumatic past and shares his pain with him. Then he attacks Claudia and purposely informs her of his knowledge of her and Louis' plot to kill Lestat, which obviously drives Claudia to feel like Louis has once again chosen a romantic partner over her. And this further isolates Louis from Claudia, pushing him into the arms of a willingly submissive Armand.
Except he just threatened me with it.
Oh, it doesn't sound like him.
You see the manipulation working almost immediately in the episode, as towards the end of it, Louis also chooses to say goodbye to Lestat. Armand maintains his modus operandi even in present time. Upon joining Louis in the interview, in season 2, Armand introduces his narrative as that of a sorrowful ancient vampire who has been subjected to control and abuse both in his human life and as a vampire. According to Armand, he has never been able to act on something for himself. He was forced to lead the coven in Paris, just like he was sort of forced to giving Louis to the coven during the trial.
I could not prevent it.
This narrative isn't so much for Daniel or for the potential book readers as it is for Louis. The underlying purpose is to remind Louis of the sacrifices that Armand has made over the 77 years together.
I was putting him in a very difficult position.
I was supposed to be luring him in, but the opposite was happening.
And Armand is generally content of his relationship with Louis because he's still able to exercise the control he wants while appearing unassuming, both as fake Rashid first and still as submissive Armand later. There is nothing that makes us think otherwise. Actually, there are a lot of implicit cues that show us just that. For example, in Dubai, books are kept out of Louis's reach because only Armand can float, symbolizing Armand's control over history of the past and knowledge. On the opposite spectrum, in New Orleans, Lestat provided Louis with a library at home, a stark contrast in their approaches to Louis' autonomy. This unwillingness to explicitly dominate is of course both an unconscious traumatic reenactment of his history. After all, complex trauma leads to dissociative states and fragmentation of the self. And by the way, this is pretty much evident in all of the characters in Interview with the Vampire.
Are you schizophrenic, Louis?
No.
I mean, did you consider yourself schizophrenic at the time?
I'm not sure the term applies to a vampire.
But definitely even more in Armand, whose fractured identity is made even more obvious by his many names and his many versions throughout the show.
Where does the bullshit start? Armand, Amadeo, Arun?
Armand's tragedy lies in his persistent failure to grasp that the path out of deep-seated trauma involves acknowledging the various facets of his personality not as wounds to be healed, but as badges of survival. These fractured parts of oneself are not supposed to be excised, but instead demands reintegration into a cohesive whole, something that instead Louis understands and finally embraces at the end of the second season. But it's also a manipulation technique.
Maître in the bedroom, maître only when it's hot or convenient.
One that even led to the possibility of the scenario of Louis' death. Why? Well, plenty of reasons, but an important one that I want to note is that while most of the characters struggle...
Let me explain. New to the new world I am.
That explains the clothes.
19th century man at heart, yes.
Armand is the one that mostly feels the burden of time. Armand's temporal liminality is exposed in his struggles to understand and appreciate the changes of the human world.
Et quand les derniers vestiges de ton époque auront disparu, les voitures, les coiffures, les croyances, comment continueras-tu? Comment vas-tu survivre à l'éternité?
In his effort to understand the now, Armand contextualizes other vampires and humans, using them as sensory markers of time. This concept appears evident in the books. During a conversation with Louis, Armand describes Claudia as an era. She's an era for you, an era of your life. If and when you break with her, you break with the only one alive who has shared that time with you. You fear that the isolation of it, the burden, the scope of eternal life. The term era, which denotes the essence of a specific period, is crucial in grasping Armand's view of Louis' relationship with Claudia as a fleeting episode in the vast expansion of eternity. At the end of the second season, after the reveal, Armand tries to convince Louis of the same idea. He reminds Louis that he has already forgiven him for the part he played in Claudia's death. Ergo, this new information shouldn't be a problem for Louis and for the future together. Claudia has been dead. Nothing should change, according to Armand. If we follow Armand's view of temporality of time, then it doesn't seem so odd that he would have risked Louis dying. Armand can always compartmentalize him as an era of his eternal life. This depiction stands in stark contrast with Lestat, whom we saw at the end of the second season in New Orleans in a profound state of despair. The years since his separation from Claudia and Louis have inflicted significant emotional wounds on Lestat. For Lestat, Claudia and Louis aren't just mere transient figures in his eternal existence. In this scene, we witness glimpses of the prideful, charming, and self-assured Lestat that Louis described. Yet we also perceive a deep vulnerability, a strong love for Louis, and a profound terror at the possibility of Louis self-harming, a fear also very much rooted in his past experience with Nikki. There is a level of self-punishment in Lestat, stemming from his role in Claudia's death and Louis' suffering. Lestat's self-punishment is manifested into how he decides to endure modern times. He corrects Louis by asserting that he's living, but it's obvious that his existence now starkly contrasts with the vibrant life he led before and during his time with Louis. He resides in a dilapidated shack in New Orleans, city which he defines as his home. But really, this is Louis and Claudia's home. He survives by consuming rats, a poignant reminder of Louis' former way of living in New Orleans. The few glimpses that we have of true Lestat so far reveal a level of strong attachment, a complete opposite of Armand's detachment explored before. Lestat's emotions are so intense that he physically places himself in locations of great personal significance. After Claudia's death and Louis' banishment, he returns to Magnus's lair, reconnecting with one of his most traumatic experiences to bridge the pain between Claudia's suffering as a young fledgling and his own. And when he can no longer be with Louis, he returns to New Orleans. This nuanced representation gains credibility as the interview narrative concludes, because we transition to a perspective that is devoid of any point of view. As such, the only objective scenes in the first two seasons of Interview with the Vampire are those set in real-time Dubai and those occurring in the present after the interview ends. In a way, the show itself, outside the bounds of perspective narration, has an omniscient view that, upon closer inspection, allows for a deeper understanding of what we could consider the closer that we can get to the actual truth. In fact, there are some objective narrative intrusions or objective correlatives, scenes that are presented from a perspective outside the biased or unreliable narration that the fandom can easily read as foreshadowing. As such, what initially may look like intruding scenes of domesticity in Dubai between Louis and Armand are placed for a specific contrapuntal narrative structure. Characters recount events as factual, but the narrative logic is later disrupted by narrative truths.
What do you think we should do with the wall?
Leave it bare then. Wait for revelation to enter the room.
This happens to be the same wall that Louis smashes Armand on after discovering his role in the trial. Likewise, in episode 14, the camera lingers on Armand when Daniel presents the script of the trial. Armand's uneasiness can be read as a way to ensure that Daniel's copy isn't the one with Armand's annotations. Back in season 1, Claudia, which will be later associated with the theatre character of a trapped bird wanting to fly away, chooses a coffin called the Feathered Nest. Regarding Claudia and unreliable narration, it is crucial to recognize that both Daniel and the audience erroneously assume that her diaries depicts events more truthfully, simply because they represent a written record. However, Claudia's narrative is inherently subjective as well. After all, we're talking about a rebellious teenager writing in a diary, a medium to express one's feelings and impressions.
You are getting access to very precious items from the archives.
An alternative perspective on the years of your interest.
We know that she writes that she's unable to dream, but Louis witnesses her experiencing a nightmare in Romania. Claudia's immediate bias between Louis and Lestat is evident. She loves Daddy Lou more than Uncle Les, and this is bound to affect her categorizations of both. Her perspective in the diaries also shifts dramatically before and after Bruce, obviously a strong traumatic event, and it's interesting to see how initially she portrays Louis and Lestat relationship as more innocent, loving, and almost comical at times.
Toi qui lui offres fait ça.
C'est une fille curieuse.
They speak in French. They gon' fight now.
Rencontrer un adolescent. Tout ce qu'il faut, c'est remettre en question l'existence.
Fight sounds funny in French.
Tu as oublié ta jeunesse. Putain de merde! Bonne nuit!
And afterwards as dark and troubled.